working at it for that long, Norm, because it's taught a lot of us the right way to try to reform society. And we're talking about the names of, I guess you would say, the proposals today, because it's interesting that we're talking so much about Kelso. He called it in his books, he called it the Industrial Homestead Act, because
Correct.
that sort of brought about the connotation of the original Homestead Act by Lincoln. When Lincoln talked about the Homestead Act, he took land, which was the productive capital of the day, and found a way to basically spread it in ownership amongst all citizens who were willing to participate. And Kelso took that idea and said, well, as we progress, the productive capital is not only land, but even more. It was the intellectual property and the equipment and the things that make society productive. And we refined it even more for a while. We called it the Capital Homestead Act, because industrial didn't really take advantage of the idea of technology enough, we thought. And now we're rebranding it again, and that's one reason we wanted to do an episode today, to announce that CESJ is in the process of rebranding this main legislative proposal to now be called the Economic Democracy Act. And Norm, tell us why this is a good change for us right now.
Well, there's several reasons. I think, first of all, I think Kelso's ideas are not just for America, but for the world. Because if the idea is a universal term that property is not bad, as the socialists and communists would say, because they're all thinking not personally, but in terms of, but collectively. So they see a collective or social tool as being the owner, and the social tool, for example, the nation state is a social tool. Money is a social tool. So we have to distinguish between our institutions or social tools. And particularly, we have to be very careful of allowing something like what Marx was pushing, eliminating private property, when that is the critical tool. Because what is private property? As I say, it's power over what you own. But America started with a sin on that. It was supposed to be over things, and they made people into things, and that's why we have the problems in America, because we're looking for, and as you know, we're very concerned with racism, because when it finally come right down to it, there's only one race. It's called human.
That's
You
right.
see,
I agree.
we have to think globally. So the Capital Homestead Act was something I don't think most people in the world understand the word homestead, because it was relevant to America. And it was a very great move by Lincoln to say that all land west of the Mississippi that had been acquired would be available, 160 acres available to every person who would go out and farm it for 5 years, and they had legal title. So it was free. But the thing about land is that it's finite.
Right.
There's just, and then of course they promised 60 acres and a mule to former slaves. And some former slaves were able to get the 360, but in any event, there was a lot of discrimination, and it was at the expense of ownership by Native Americans. It took their land and did it inside and just took it by
Right.
force. So we had that problem. In other words, we're looking as if Caucasians or people who with light skin somehow are superior to people whose color may be different. It offends me, because we have to recognize, if you want peace, you better promote justice for all, not for the few. And
Right.
so this is what Kelso. So capital homesteading, even though we used it, I used it for many years. Kelso never talked about the Capital Homestead Act, you know, and I worked with him, by the way. We haven't mentioned that. I soon, when I quit the government, I think this part of the history is important. I was hired by Dick Boone, who became the head of the Citizens Crusade Against Poverty. It was there to criticize what was going wrong with the government's poverty program. And Dick he was a friend of Bob Kennedy. He wrote the language of maximum feasible participation of the poor in the law, which is what it was like a magnet when I saw that. It made so much sense. And he was open-minded. He agreed that Kelso's ideas were important. He was also the head of Bob Kennedy after Kennedy was assassinated. Dick became the head of the foundation, Robert F. Kennedy Foundation. Really great person, and really liked the new paradigm. And we did all that we could to get so-called liberals to support it. And I brought Kelso into the Citizens Crusade. We had over 1,000 people at a meeting, and Kelso just said he proposed that the Citizens Crusade study these ideas. Well, the establishment, not Ruther, but the establishment, Mike Harrington and other socialists were very opposed to Kelso's ideas. So they then put it to a vote. How would that audience take Kelso's idea to just study the idea of ownership? In any event, they went contrary to all rules of procedure. They said all opposed to this motion. And these people governing the people and this event found that we had gotten grassroots leaders from all over the country to come in and be involved with the Citizens Crusade, and they voted for Kelso, despite what this leadership was saying. And unfortunately, and they voted, and it was passed to adopt this resolution, and then the board would meet on it, but with other resolutions. And then, this is great history, by the way, the next day, Sergeant Shriver, who was Bob Kennedy's brother-in-law and the head of the poverty program, gave a lecture that really disturbed the grassroots people, and unfortunately we had to get him out of the guide him. I had to get him surrounded to leave the audience. Because people were worried about any harm to him, and we did get him out. But that almost destroyed the Citizens Crusade, where you had this event. And then when they later met, they did approve every one of the resolutions except one.
Wow.
The Kelso resolution to study this is the problem with this ideological war that we have. People who are so poorly, despite the fact that they write books and so on, academia is so far behind when it comes to the paradigm that people are not open. It's like in any event.
It's like something's holding them back, isn't it?
Well, it's academic. That's right. It's hard to come in with a new paradigm. We have to understand the power of existing thought. It really takes time for people to be open-minded to new truths, simple
Absolutely.
truths.
And speaking of all of this history, Norm, here we are in 2020. and we're seeing a mass awareness about disparities in society, probably more right now than any time, probably since the 60s when you were making progress, in so many areas. And I think there's a new focus on racial injustice, of course, because of all the things that have gone on.
Right.
So we really like using the term economic democracy. How can economic democracy be the key to addressing, the disparities and even racial injustice?
Yeah. Well, I think if we take the word democracy, it's power of the people. In politics, we see that if you have the vote, you have a way to supposedly the voters control the state. Now, the state is your only legitimate social monopoly. In other words, you have religious institutions, you have educational institutions, health institutions, many others, but they're not. And of course, a market system. This is one of the other factors in Kelso's idea, is a free market system, which is rejected by socialists and communists. They want the state to say what the value of things are, and so we have the mess that we have now, and so people don't have. They're not open-minded yet. But that's the job of the Center for Economic and Social Justice. We have to be able to convince them. And that means new leaders. We had a meeting with Pope John Paul II. He wrote his dissertation before he became Pope on personalism. Every
Right.
person must be treated, not individualism, but personalism. There's a difference.
Right.
The individual is only looking for themselves.
And let me add that we call our ideas the just third way, because in almost every category we have a third way to describe things, a third offering, as
Right.
opposed to capitalism versus socialism. Well, we bring in the third ism, which is personalism, and that's what you're talking about. It happened to be the same subject that Dr. Martin Luther King studied his dissertation.
He
Uh,
did his dissertation. You're right, Dave. He did
yep.
his dissertation on personalism, and
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 so and
and
and so
and he
we're calling it
also
economic personalism. His was a philosophical and sort of religious personalism, but we're calling it economic personalism because, like we were saying, democracy is important, but there's different kinds of democracy. There's political democracy, which is the ballot box, but then we
right.
offer a plan that is economic
Ex-
democracy, and that is
you
not
have
the
it.
ballot box, right? That's the financial system, right?
You see, you're right. You're right. Yeah, it's different. But you mentioned King and his dissertation. If you go to our quote section on our website, which is www.cesj.org, you'll see some of the quotes, including King and popes and religious leaders, spiritual leaders. But King said in a speech to his organization that we need a new synthesis beyond capitalism and communism. And this is the new synthesis, you see. And I
Right.
met with King at Medgar Evers's funeral, but really never had a chance to point out the Kelso idea. But he was reading the Kelso, the Capitalist Manifesto book, and Kelso had a second book, which was it was on the money system and how the money system could be used to bring about the just third way. But anyway, so we need someone like a King. We need, and then Father Ferri, who was one of the leaders in the Catholic Church, recognized, he was the head of Dayton University when we met him, and he was known throughout the world for his writing on social justice and social charity. And I never knew what that term was before Father Free. And he used to drive 500 miles from Dayton every month to attend the initial meetings of the CESJ. He was in his 80s at that time, and he would call it his social pilgrimage. He'd come 500 miles and he would discuss social justice while I would be talking about economic Kelso, but he accepted that. It made a lot of sense to him, and so we have the center. This is formed in 1984. But Father Ferree, the idea of social justice is an interesting one because the socialists like to use it, but they're wrong. Social justice is, if you have an idea, like Kelso had an idea, it's not automatically going to be understood by people. So how do you bring it about? Well, you bring others. You teach others what those basic principles, what the new logic, what the vision is, but you'll only get a few in the beginning. So what do you have to do? Well, you do exactly what King was suggesting. Peaceful people power, not violent. People power, but peaceful people power. And that's what we're trying to do in CESJ. Throughout the world, I got people from, we educated or we trained 7 Humphrey Fellows, Hubert Humphrey Fellowships, people from 7 different countries. Most of them were Muslim countries, but they loved it. And a fellow from Morocco who was in the central bank of Morocco, and he was a professor and also a judge. I mean, I think he's going to be, Marwan was his name. He's going to be a president of his country. He really has it, and he's going around promoting the Just Third Way. Well, when he heard that we were changing the name, he said he liked economic democracy. So that's a word that can be understood by anyone in the world. Even people in Russia today are writing me in support of that. People in China, we were dealing with, we had some communication with young people in Hong Kong, in Taiwan. And so there is a way in which we're going to go beyond communism and beyond capitalism. It's just a matter of open-minded new leadership, or getting existing leaders, people vying for the White House, to begin to become aware. And we have had success. Hubert Humphrey was once, when we began to have successes in Congress, as Kelso, as his Washington counsel, I was there promoting ESOPs, the employee stock ownership plans. Let's see, I left the crusade in 1968 to join, Kelso and I formed the Institute for the Study of Economic Systems. And I had people from the left, we had people from the right, we had Marion Barry, who later became the mayor of Washington, D.C., who was a SNCC. He was part of SNCC. We had the head of CORE. We had the head of people from the right. We had Shirley Temple Black, and her husband were part of it, but also just a whole number of people who, conservatives and leaders of very influential corporations. So we had that back in 1968 when we formed, and that was important. But
well, let me tie in a couple of things that you said real quick, Norm. For one thing, we were talking about Dr. King and how he had just started to look at the ideas when his life was unfortunately ended on an untimely basis. You can refer back to the Just Third Way podcast number 26, and my interview with Dr. Virgil Wood. And he confirmed that Dr. King was starting to look at the ideas and was saying favorable things about them, and encouraged Virgil's work in that area. And while we're referencing previous podcasts, you said Marwan El Alawi. He's known as Dr. Marwan also. All of these people with doctorates, have a lot of education and experience, and all come to the same conclusions. And his podcast is number 63, so I hope you'll check that out.
Oh, that's right. You did interview. That's great. He's wonderful. He's
Yep.
wonderful.
And let me go ahead and say also that our website is CESJ.org, where you can find these ideas, and we hope everyone will refer to that. And one reason I'm mentioning that, Norm, is we've already gone a long time, and I'm going to just keep going, but we'll probably break this up into two sections. So I wanted to mention that. Go to CESJ.org.